Dear students, dear prospective students, dear audience, my name is Kamil Mikulski. I specialize in hybrid threats monitoring, and I've got huge pleasure and I'm very gratitude to European Academy of Diplomacy for having me here as a moderator of that panel. The panel is very interesting because, as we all know, the Chinese saying, may you live in interesting times, is both adequate and probably false. And certainly, we are living in interesting times. This panel is titled Disinformation in the Age of Information Warfare. And with that, I would like to, first of all, underline that we, just a few years back, we wouldn't be imagining speaking of disinformation and warfare at an occasion like this mostly, but also we probably wouldn't put these two horrible things in just one sentence. And I have been having a little bit of issues trying to figure out shouldn't we, for example, invite as a third speaker the General Secretary of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, because we're going to discuss warfare here. So it sounds very much militaristic. Yet it is also quite sure that disinformation that can have kinetic effects and other hybrid threats, basically information warfare, are primarily having civilian aspects, and they're targeting various domains. For example, hybrid COE has found 13 different domains in which disinformation is operating, and also malign actors, foreign powers, and state and non-state actors are active. I am very lucky here that as I'm not able to provide a sufficient context, that I have two excellent speakers who are going to save me from that oppression and provide some more interesting and some more detailed insights into how disinformation is actually working in the times of information warfare. And with this, I would like to introduce, first of all, Professor Sally Toya, who is teaching at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. She's got a PhD in journalism and communication, and she's also the head of the Media and Communications Department at the Arab Academy for Science, Technology, and Maritime Transport. She is also researching journalism, media, information literacy, news literacy, harmful content such as misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. And she is also researching youth's political engagement. The second speaker I would like to introduce is Madame Zea Sebeni, an expert, a social psychologist and doctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki. Her profile is a bit more linked to cognitive aspects of hybrid warfare and information warfare. And also she is researching the societal vulnerabilities and resilience, basically how functions the realm of disinformation. She examines the motivations that drive individuals to believe in it. So pretty much cognitive aspects if it comes to the society as a whole. But EU and NATO are having very interesting concepts on how to approach disinformation and build societal resilience. One is called Whole of Society, and the other one is called Whole of Government. But about that, we'll be discussing just a moment. We have also said that information warfare is something very specific, and so is disinformation. And with that, I would like to start asking and the right questions and turn to our speakers and ask them how do they define the age of information warfare? Is it some kind of a specific age that has never happened before? Is it distinct from what we've seen in the past? What is basically the characteristics of the age of information warfare? How do you understand it? And with this question, I would like to start with Professor Toya.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mikulski, for this very important introduction, shedding light on such a pressing matter such as disinformation and information warfare. I would like to begin by thanking you for this introduction, by thanking the European Academy of Diplomacy and the NED for organizing such an important webinar. So in response to your question, the age of information warfare can basically be defined as the contemporary era characterized by a pervasive use of digital technology and the internet to manipulate and spread and weaponize information for political, societal, and economic influence, right? It's very interesting that you shed light on whether this existed before, because disinformation and misinformation has historically existed. However, this age actually distinguishes itself from other times by the rapid dissemination, the anonymity, the amplification and the use of advanced technologies to deceive and to shape public perception in a very manipulative manner, if I may say. So if we're speaking about dissemination of harmful content, it's very important to define and shed light on what disinformation is, right? So it's a term that is used to refer to the deliberate falsification of information, right? And this is, of course, usually done for different reasons or with various intentions. The EU Disinfo Lab categorizes such intentions into 4 different intentions to disseminate and engage in disinformation. The first would be disinformation for foreign influence, right? Or the use of disinformation by foreign actors to disrupt societies over certain issues or to push a certain agenda. The second intention would be for political use, right? So the use of disinformation to undermine adversaries or push a certain agenda, and this usually takes place on a domestic level. The third intention would be lucrative, right? So the use of disinformation to make a profit. And finally, it would be issue-based. So the use of disinformation to serve an ideological, a normative, or a financial goal. Having said that, researchers, one of the most prominent researchers in the field of disinformation, Wardle, defines 7 different types of misinformation and disinformation. So we have satire or parody, misleading content, imposter content, fabricated content, false connection, right? When headlines and visuals or captions do not really support the real content, false context or taking content out of context, and finally, manipulated content. So back to the reflection you would like us to make here on what distinguishes the current age of information warfare or the current age of disinformation. So I would like, in order to answer this question, I would like to shed light on key factors that shape the current media and information environment, right? So the first factor would be the very rapid digital transformation. Such transformation gives rise to the rapid dissemination of information on a global scale, right? Enabling, as you referred in your introduction, both state and non-state actors to manipulate narratives with the intention to manipulate public opinion at an unprecedented pace. The second factor would be the idea of amplification and virality that we're seeing on all social media platforms and all the online networks, right, which allow the information to spread quickly and widely. And actually, studies have found that, unfortunately, false or misleading information go viral at a much quicker pace than accurate or truthful information. The third factor we have that characterizes the current information environment is that we have moved from a traditional model of oligopoly where the information flow has been historically controlled by a few, into a model where we have innumerable information sources and content creators, right? So with the merits and the power this gives the different users, we have a result of an exaggerated abundance of information, leading to what is known as the information chaos leading to the mix between quality content and low quality information. And we actually have something like content farms emerging and spreading to generate low quality information for profit. The fourth factor that I would like to shed light on is the anonymity and disguise. So the fact that in this current age, actors can operate with a high degree of anonymity using fake identities and profile to spread disinformation exacerbates the problem and makes it much more difficult to control, right? So over the past years, we have seen a rise in what is known as bots, for example, right? Which is an autonomous program on the internet or another network that can interact with systems or users. We have seen this demonstrated in accounts that are automated, right, that control the public perceptions or the public views regarding different issues. One of the most important examples is a very important investigation done by The Guardian, right, in which they revealed the hacking and disinformation team, which managed to meddle in different elections in different parts of the world, known in the media as Team Jorge, right? The mastermind of this team is Tal Hanan, right? An Israeli professional in the field of faking social media profiles and meddling with the public opinion using bots and so on.
Yeah, this is really interesting because meddling in elections and foreign interference, this is one of the situations in which we do have a third party. Of course, the third party can be either external, like some kind of another state, or sometimes it's a non-state actor, but could be external. But sometimes the problem is quite domestic. Yet we are still discussing information warfare. And here I would like to ask this very similar question about the nature of the age of disinformation, also about information warfare as a whole. How do you perceive? How would you conceptualize it? That around how is this different from what we've seen before? And that question goes to the second expert, Madame Zia Seberi.
Thank you so much. And I would also like to extend my thanks to the European Academy of Diplomacy and NED for organizing this panel. I think it's a great topic. Also, thank you, Camille, for the great introduction. And thank you, Sally, for taking part and for setting the stage so well, explaining all of this, because I think that you did so very well. I think that the question is really good because I often encounter this question as well because I research disinformation, which also entails propaganda, which also entails politicians. So it's often like, okay, is this like new? We had it for like always, right? So like what makes this age different, or what is really like this age of like information warfare? So I think that's a very relevant question. And I think that like the age of information warfare is like the beginning of it is really difficult to pinpoint. We could see it already like late 20th century, like the beginnings as like the computer started to play a critical role in military operations and international communication. And of course, like the end of the Cold War, the advent of the internet accelerated this trend pretty much, with significant developments in the 90s and early 2000s as like cyber attacks, which also like part of this like whole information warfare became more common. But it's actually the 21st century where we can say that we see this full realization of the age of information warfare, with basically every nation recognizing that they have to invest into these. We can also see that like people are aware of it. Like there are always these Eurobarometers where they ask people like, do you encounter like disinformation? And a very high number of people say that, yes, I do encounter disinformation. So this is something on people's minds, which is again, like, I think characterizes this age. And also, I think if you look at like very current events, it sounds kind of bad, but you can also see that like the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia has been called like the first TikTok war. So again, that kind of shows that information and information warfare and where we find the information is like changing. And I think that's very much part of this, this 21st century. You're muted.
Apologies. It's a very interesting topic, especially that the last time I checked Eurobarometer, which is an excellent tool to see how how Europeans as a whole they perceive disinformation. I think that the last time they touched upon that subject was 2019. But maybe there is something new. Yet I would love to have some more information that will be a bit more regional on the general perspective. I would like now to come back for a moment to Professor Toya, because we had a very interesting summary of disinformation theory, also quite close to the 5 Ds of disinformation. If we have any students here, this is a good time to know that disinformation is serving to dismay, to distort, to distract, to divide, and basically this is a tool that is weaponized against society. But we're not only discussing societies here. When we think of information warfare, and we've been discussing that times are changing, that everything is getting more perilous, I would like to ask you, Professor, if we think of security, we sometimes also think of geopolitics, and here do you think that there are some geopolitical events, and specific ones, that impact the discourse, that they are linked to more widespread manifestation of disinformation? Do malign actors are using any specific geopolitical momentums to spread it? I also know that you're very familiar with Egyptian perspective, and we very rarely hear any inputs like this. I would like to use this opportunity to hear your unique insights in this fashion. So if you could comment on geopolitical events and disinformation also on Egyptian perspective, I would be very grateful.
Thank you very much. Of course, geopolitics play a very significant role in this discussion around disinformation, right? Because of course, in this age of information warfare, as we're referring to it, there's an elevated importance of information as a tool for statecraft, right? So nations are increasingly engaged in strategic operations using disinformation as a means to achieve geopolitical objectives. Of course, if we're talking about the situation in Egypt, unfortunately, we are currently finding ourselves in a time of geopolitical challenges in the Middle East, and especially very near to Egypt, with the ongoing conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, right? The Palestine-Israel conflict. Unfortunately, there's a wide perception, if we're talking about the disinformation discourse in Egypt, for instance, or in the Arab world right now, there is a wide perception among citizens in the Arab world that the global media, which is predominantly Western, is misinforming and disinforming the global audience with political intention to manipulate the public opinion in order to achieve certain political agendas or certain stances with one side of this conflict, right? It's a historically known fact that the war zones, be they in the Middle East or elsewhere, right, frequently become battlegrounds, not just for the armed forces, as you kindly said in your introduction, Camille, but also for narratives, right? So it's a battleground for narratives. And in Egypt and the Arab world, there is a prevailing sentiment, actually a perception, that the global media machine serves the interest of one side, particularly given the fact that the ownership is centralized and controlled primarily by the West, right? So this perception has increasingly been pronounced in recent time during the heightened tensions in Gaza over the past month, especially that the citizens here are not just counting on the global mainstream media. They are checking sources, eyewitnesses of journalists on the ground in Palestine, in Gaza. We're also kind of having the perception that there is a double standard in the media coverage, especially if we contrast it to the most recent war in the world right before this conflict, which is the Russia-Ukraine war, right? So, for instance, we have seen that the media coverage to this war, unfortunately, in different instances, has been described as racist coverage, right? So we've heard comments such as Ukraine isn't a place like Iraq or Afghanistan. It has been where the conflict has been raging for decades. Or, for instance, sympathizing comments such as it's very emotional because we see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair. So this kind of leaves the perception that there are some lives that matter more than others, right? And that the international or the global media, that many of which has been historically trusted sources of information in Egypt, are kind of pushing this narrative to the whole world, right? And of course, there are striking and readily apparent illustrations, right, inconsistent practices adopted by numerous international organizations, such as, for instance, using titles that in the Arab world we absolutely disagree with, such as the Israel-Hamas war. This is no longer perceived as an Israel-Hamas war here. It's perceived as a Palestinian genocide, right? So when we see such portrayal, it's very frustrating, and there's the perception that this is disinforming the global public opinion. Also, the differences we are witnessing in the coverage to both sides, right? So one side, on one side, the Palestinian casualties are covered predominantly in numbers, right? While the Israeli casualties are covered in a humanizing coverage by featuring their devastated families, featuring their names, their pictures, right? So what consequence does this have on the public opinion? It kind of dehumanizes Palestinians and Arabs and makes it easier to accept what's happening by desensitizing the global public opinion through this kind of narrative. We've also unfortunately been a bit frustrated, or a lot frustrated, by what the big tech companies and platforms have been doing, such as the Meta company, for instance, using the algorithms to surface one side of the argument and kind of push down another side of the argument. So you will see Egyptians using some tricks in order to trick the algorithm into surfacing their content to make their voices heard, right? So kind of seeking an almost equal coverage of their voices. We also see repetition, much coverage to one side. So this cultivates certain narratives and frames. We are seeing journalists, well-known, renowned journalists, failing to abide by the journalist code of honor, such as defending human rights, dignity, values, respecting and presenting a pluralism of views and ideas. So in summary, I think this is how the geopolitical events are kind of unfolding a perception about the disinformation discourse as pushed by the global and international media rather than by other dark organizations. So this is a very sad situation.
Indeed, I have taken myself a liberty to take some notes from what you said, and we can summarize that, for example, diverging opinions and trying to understand various perspectives is one of the most important stuff to understand how disinformation is first of all spreading, but also how to counter it. So basically, knowing audiences and responding to various events is extremely crucial. We have also mentioned a few other interesting things. For example, the things like lots of pictures with juxtaposing Ukrainians and people from the wider Middle East and North Africa in the beginning of the outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian war. I do remember that I have collected myself lots of propaganda pictures for my students, and these kinds of stuff were created and perpetuated by accounts aligned with Kremlin, or basically something that looks pretty much like Russian trolls. So even if there are existing narratives, they are sometimes amplified from the outside, and people are not always able to protect themselves. And with this, I would like to ask a second question, this time to Madame Zeasebeni. There are some countries in Europe that are faring better with building societal resilience than others. And here I would like to ask you that Finland is considered one of the most resilient countries in Europe when it comes to safeguarding against information warfare. Can you tell us what makes Finland outstanding here and what makes its policy unique? Is there any pattern behind the success of Finland here?
Yes, I think that the Finnish case is very interesting to examine in that sense that it is one of the top nations which is most resilient against disinformation. Of course, like information warfare also extends to like other aspects as it's like part of the national strategy to prevent against like cybercrime. And of course, like Finland is in a unique like geopolitical position. It's in the EU. It's recently joined NATO, and it has a very, very long border with Russia, and of course has a very deep history with Russia, full of conflicts. So of course, this geopolitical position also puts it at risk of Russian disinformation or pro-Kremlin disinformation. But what makes Finland quite unique or quite resilient against disinformation? I think we can point to several reasons. One is education, so it's media literacy, which is heavily emphasized in Finnish schools. From an early age, students are usually taught to critically evaluate information sources. This education extends into public campaigns on media literacy for the general populations. This basically like equips citizens with the tools to recognize and resist propaganda and disinformation. So this is like the very basics of it. Another important factor, and there's been several studies on like more systemic factors, like what makes countries resilient against disinformation. And one of them is not only that there is, and it's true for Finland too, that there is a strong independent media, but a strong and independent public service media. And there Finland, I think, fares pretty well as there is a strong and independent public media system. I think here it's very it can be very interesting, like contrast with other European Union member countries, such as Hungary, where there is a strong public media, but it is not under government control, basically. And of course, like that distorts like the disinformation sphere. But basically, Finland having this like strong public media, which is independent, and actually is watched by people and followed by people, where people can feel that they can get quality information, is very important. And of course, like there can be a public, like a good public service media, but what does it worth if people don't trust it? So it goes hand in hand with a strong institutional trust, that people do trust this public source of information, that people do follow the public service media online or on TV, and they feel that they do get some point of like quality information. If they are in doubt, they can turn to that like media source. I'm not saying here right now that like this media is perfect or there isn't like criticism of it, but on the whole, like this is the situation which I think is like greatly enhancing, or is like a very good thing. And especially now that like the trust in media, trust in institutions, like generally in the EU, but also outside of the EU, is like going down. Like people are more and more skeptical. I think this is still like a strong suit.
Thank you. That is really interesting, especially when you can see basically what Finland has been doing in how it created its own position, especially when you consider the role of media. And with media, I would like to ask another question, this time back to Professor Toja. We have been discussing emotions, we have been discussing youth, and also humanization and dehumanization. And here I would like to maybe stop a little bit, take a few steps back and look at the society as a whole, but maybe not as a whole, but a specific segment. I would like to discuss the youth. I know that you have been researching that topic, and here I would like to find out how disinformation influences Egyptian youth. Can you tell us a bit more, like what kind of media do they mostly consume? Is there any particular social platforms that are more used than the others? Is it the same like in some other countries? How popular are encrypted channels such as WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram? They're especially difficult to research if it comes to disinformation. Well, maybe Telegram is a bit more open than some of others. But in the end, what I really want to understand is, do you have any prescription how to build societal resilience in Egypt, especially among the youth, if it comes to disinformation, and also not the domestic one, but the situation when we've got some other parties trying to influence the discourse?
Thank you very much. So let me take the very first part of your question and take a little bit from what Mazea just mentioned regarding the trust in the media, right? So unfortunately, in Egypt, like I think a lot of the countries in the world, according to international research, there is a state of declining trust in the media. Accordingly, the majority of the younger generations, right, resort to social media platforms for their news diet or for their information diet, right? So for instance, at the beginning of 2023, we have 72.2% of Egyptians on the internet connected, right? We have 46.25 million social media users. The most used social media platform in Egypt would be Facebook. I know that this is a bit different in Europe. I think the younger generations are kind of migrating away from Facebook in Europe big time, right? But in Egypt, it's pretty much still popular among the younger generations. Also, Instagram, Snapchat, WhatsApp, definitely. It's like a daily routine that they're all the time on their WhatsApp for different uses and different purposes. TikTok is gaining huge popularity among the Egyptian young people. Now, having said that, it's as I mentioned at the very beginning, it's very important and interesting to have a wide variety of voices, a wide variety of sources for information. However, with how the social media platforms function, it becomes very risky just to count on that for your news diet, right? We're all very much aware that social media platforms present a very closed version of the information to each individual, given the fact that it depends on the personalization algorithms, right? So this results in what is known as the filter bubbles. It results in what is known as echo chambers, right? In which I kind of see my voice and my belief echoed many times. So what kind of consequences does this have on Egyptian youth, or I would say on youth in general? So I wouldn't specify Egyptian. I think it's a global effect in that sense. Of course, the first thing is confirmation of different realities. So everyone has their own version of reality. Which leads many times to polarization, right? So I form my attitude and opinion based on information, regardless of whether this information is misleading or truthful, right? Regarding the different issues, regarding different political issues. This has been very much prominent, for instance, during the COVID-19 crisis, in which we've had a divide in the Egyptian society, pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine. And unfortunately, both decisions many times were not really based on science, were not really based on evidence. They were more based on fears, on conspiracy theories of planting chips in the bodies of people through the vaccine, you know, and this, I think this one is pretty much global, and we've had it in Egypt as well. So this leads to a total case of information chaos, right? We're not sure what to believe. We're not sure what our opinions and attitudes regarding different matters are based on. How to confront this? Definitely, I agree with Ms. Zia mentioning media and information literacy. And we've had a lot of efforts made by educators and university professors to train media professionals as well as prepare citizens, right? So we do it on the university level. We try to do it on the more global level among the different users. So I will put it in the words of the famous scholar Noam Chomsky, who said, the solution is building an intellectual self-defense, right? And I see media and information literacy as pretty much an intellectual self-defense.
I think that you have summarized something very, very important. Like, this is, in fact, a global threat. Yes, and I am sorry, it was frozen for a moment. Are we
Yeah, now
so
you're good.
good?
you're
Okay, I don't know if you lost something or from my warning that the questions are mounting on WhatsApp, but we will come to that. You also mentioned that, well, young people are migrating from Facebook to other places. Yes, we know it, that we observe it. Also, some time ago, I had a pleasure to ask one of my younger colleagues what are the most interesting and prolific memes that they are creating, and I heard that memes are for old people. So as you say, things are changing. And now a little bit more on security issue. I would like to direct another question to Madam Zea Sebeni. If it comes to national security, disinformation is obviously a threat, and we need to protect our society against it. But I'm very glad that, first of all, I have both of you here, so we can hear different perspectives. But then also, as you are tied to both Hungary and Finland, and this comparative element is especially valuable, I would like to ask you, how does disinformation affect both of these societies, if you could compare one with another? And if you also think on the malign actors, like what tactics or narratives do they using? Are they the same in Finland or in Hungary, or is there any difference between these measures used by malign actors?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and also I think those two cases are like very, very valuable to compare. I would say that it is very different. Both the landscape is different and the disinformation is different. So I think we talked now in this panel a lot about like how there are certain outside actors like threatening national security, so like the geopolitical position, etc. And it is the case in Finland that, like, for example, an outside threat can be Russia and like Russian disinformation, pro-Kremlin narratives, etc. And in Hungary, there is a very prominent pro-Russian narratives and pro-Russian disinformation, but we can see, so to say, an internal threat, or to say a government takeover of the information sphere. So basically disinformation is coming from government sources, it's coming from official sources, it's coming from public service media. So I think that most might be familiar with that the Hungarian democracy is eroding, and it's very much can be seen through the media as well. There has been a large takeover of public service media and also of private media. Now more than 70% of like all media belong to like pro-government influence, or like either direct or through oligarchs. So it is a very different kind of setting in that sense when it is those in power who spread the disinformation. And I also want to comment something interesting about trust. We just did a study which will be published very soon, where we basically try to profile information and disinformation believers in the Hungarian context. And we saw that there is we did 4 profiles of people, and there was one profile where actually very high trust in media, very high trust in institutions went hand in hand with disinformation belief and conspiracy beliefs. So that just means that there are those people in such a context, especially who have very high trust towards like everything around them, but still they do believe conspiracies and disinformation. And this is because it is such a hijacked sphere that we usually don't very much see this kind of profile, because we're used to like, okay, like trust is going down, then like disinformation belief is going up because like people are turning to like social media and alternative sources. But here, like in Hungary, or like in similar contexts as Hungary, you can see that like, okay, I'm trusting the official sources, I'm listening to the politicians, I'm listening to the official radio, and I believe conspiracies and I believe disinformation, since there is so much disinformation spread by government actors. And part of it is, just to compare a bit more, is, as I said, like pro-Kremlin kind of disinformation, but also we can see a lot of those like global narratives. I think Sally, you also mentioned, and I just want to highlight like how, because of like the global interconnectedness, we can really see that like global narratives are localizing. So it's either the same or like very similar. COVID pandemic, like everywhere it was about the chips and Bill Gates. You can see that like QAnon, which is like, seems like a very American thing. Like there are local QAnon groups in Finland, for example. So it's like these global narratives are taken and then localized. And in Hungary, similarly, there are those like global narratives localized, for example, like COVID pandemic, but also the government like routinely makes up these like conspiracy theories, for example, like the Soros conspiracies. Of course, like they are also global, but like very much part of like the main government narrative.
Very briefly, because you have touched upon an interesting subject, we've got a very diverse audience. Not everyone knows what's the difference between disinformation and misinformation. So if you could just comment in a few words, how do these two differ? And after your answer, I would like to go back to Professor Zoya.
Yes, I think that's like a fundamentally good question. So basically, disinformation has a malicious intent behind spreading it, while misinformation does not. So I think that a good way to think about it is citizens who like read disinformation like are misinformed. They don't necessarily know that they like read disinformation, right? But those who like produce disinformation, they do have a malicious intent behind it. Like I want you to believe this. I want to disinform you. And the same with like people who like share disinformation. They don't necessarily share it with the malicious intent, but they might think that this is true. So I'm sharing this like very good information with you. I'm misinformed. I don't know. So I think that it's also like good to make that difference, or like think about that aspect, that like all like regular people who like reshare things on Facebook or on Twitter, they might do it like maliciously to disinform, or they might just do it because they are misinformed and they are just resharing it. I hope that like makes it clearer.
It absolutely does, and nobody's actually exempted from disinformation. And I just shared mine by accidentally calling Professor Toya Professor Zoya, for which I apologize. And here I have one more question to you, Professor. We know already how disinformation, misinformation, and other hybrid threats are targeting our societies, and we have understood that there are biases involved, there are emotions, there are diverging perspectives, and many other things. But we didn't really discuss that much how to counteract it. Of course, we discussed the policy of Finland and it as an example, but here a bit more on the operational level. I would like to ask you if there are any strategies and techniques to counteract disinformation, either globally or in Egypt, as you prefer. But I would be personally very happy to hear how Egypt is trying to protect its own society against this information warfare. Hear about some best practices and lessons learned, and basically understood how we can develop this counteracting based on these lessons learned and best practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the correction. Right. So of course, it's a very controversial question, right? Because as Ms. Zaya just mentioned, there is this controversy between issuing laws, for instance, to try to control disinformation, and then when there is a state interference, the global society or the societies tend to worry about the freedom of expression and the freedom of speech, right? So finding the balance there. I think the best model to go would be to equip the citizens. In Egypt, for example, one of the best practices we have is the Arab chapter of UNESCO's Media and Information Literacy Alliance, which works extensively to raise awareness through media campaigns, training media professionals and youth on media and information literacy. For instance, last September, around 75 media professionals from Egypt and the Arab countries were trained, right, with the main objective to empower them to deal with the media in what we call a responsible and a healthy manner. We've also had in Egypt and globally the rise of the fact-checking industry, right? Which kind of supplements the role of journalists here in trying to debunk and to break down the different disinformation aspects, right? So I would say, if we're talking in terms of action, it's very important to bring all stakeholders together in a collaborative action plan to kind of promote this intellectual self-defense by instilling media and information literacy in societies. So there should be interventions on the level of the industry involving the media professionals and the platforms, right? Calling for human vetting, for instance, rather than pure automated content moderation, aligning interests of the platforms with those of the users, right? For example, on another level, civil society and citizens should be involved by raising their awareness about the cost of free services. So you're using social media for free, but is it really for free? Are you sure? Right? So raising awareness about the cost of using free services and encouraging initiatives that serve the public good. On the level of academia, of course, where we're all part of, extending research, right, to reach concrete conceptualizations of the different aspects of media and information literacy, especially with the rapid evolution of the technology and the media environment and how it changes very rapidly. On the level of government, policy and decision makers, it's very important to have them on board, right, to draft more laws, to regulate while balancing the free nature of the different social media platforms, for instance, and to strengthen journalists to kind of make the public service media or the public media more resilient to the challenges that the digital transformation is posing, and hence fostering higher levels of trust among citizens. I think this utopian scenario is the best way to go around fighting against disinformation. There are so many good practices around the world, so let's stay hopeful that this will be implemented locally in the different countries soon.
Thank you. This is really illuminated. It comes how to what can we do to fight in this situation. There, it's no longer looking so dark here. But here, I would like to ask my last question from the list to Madame Zia Sebeni. When we think of disinformation, we're frequently discussing words like populism or conspiracy theories. And we have seen, at least from the times of COVID, that these have quite penetrated our societies. We have also seen that, for example, social media platforms, algorithms were also meddling in our echo chambers. Like Madame Toya, Professor Toya has mentioned that, for example, Meta was not given enough attention or didn't display enough what is happening in the Middle East. On the other hand, we also know that X, formerly Twitter, algorithms were biased against Ukrainians and were, after some time, showing fewer and fewer messages that were related to the topic of the Russo-Ukrainian war. So we see that they're basically shaping our discourse and how we perceive news. And Madame Sebeni, here I've got a question. Some scholars say that we need to develop epistemological security, which is a very fancy and academic word, basically, for a situation in which there are external factors that determine in the things in which we believe. Like, how do we self perceive things that we should believe? How is our discourse shaped? How do we choose our facts? How do we choose our truths and things like this? You have researched societal responses to truths, post-truths, and related issues. So I would like to ask you how to make sense of things when we're polluted by disinformation, in which we continuously get lots of various information from all over the world. Like Professor Toya said, this is global. We're global consumers in a way. how can we reclaim our information environment and will stay mentally healthy, preserve this mental hygiene when faced with disinformation and these half-truths or fake news sometimes?
Well, that's kind of $1 million question, right? Yeah, I think partly I can echo what Sally said about like media literacy, and I think that it is important to emphasize again like the role of social media here, because I think if we would have this like conversation like a couple of years back, then maybe we would be talking about like social media companies should regularize themselves, or like they will take care of it. And I think that by this time we can see that they will not. So that we have to regulate these platforms. And I think that it is a problem that we basically allowed social media platforms to become so-called epistemic authorities, which again is a fancy word for saying that they, like we say that like traditional epistemic authorities or like sources of knowledge were like experts or like government or like expert organization, but like now we basically have social media platforms as epistemic authorities. Like they decide like what can be there, what can be there, and I think that now we're facing that like, okay, this is actually a problem, like we should have regulated this like long ago. So I think that regulating social media more heavily from the outside, so like not letting them decide how they do that, is going to be very important, especially with like the rise of like other social media platforms such as TikTok, which is becoming very dominant. And I think it's also important to emphasize, as you said, that like, okay, how do we make sense of all of this, is that believing disinformation and believing conspiracy theories and populism and all of these things are some kind of a symptom of like, for example, polarization. So it's not like we can just get like rid of like disinformation and we can get rid of like conspiracy theories without addressing like the certain like pressures in society, the differences in society. So I think a lot of it like comes down to this polarization. It's not like Sally also mentioned that like COVID, and like we also can see elsewhere that like COVID kind of just sped up everything, that like suddenly like societies became so polarized on like the vaccine, and suddenly like that gave rise to like misinformation, to mistrust, to like worsening like even like interpersonal relationships, like people not talking to their family because like they took the vaccine or they didn't take the vaccine. So I think it's important to note that like besides eliminating those like polarizations and those like societal stresses, it's very important to like just get rid of disinformation or just get rid of conspiracies, and that makes the question, I see, like even more complicated. But this is what I also see in research, that often when people like encounter disinformation, for example, in like comments or like subsequent discussions, they are not talking about like specific news, they are talking about like the other things which that like information or disinformation triggers. So it's not just about like what's there, but like what's behind all that, like the distrust or like the differences or all of those things which are like behind all of these mechanisms. So I think that's important to notice. And I also think that this is just like very, because I'm a psychologist, so I guess that maybe I should say this, that I think it's also important to try to address this in a very small scale. So I think that turning with empathy towards people who have fallen down like rabbit holes, I think that's important, because by alienating them, we are kind of sending them into those like alternative sources where they are waiting for them with open arms. So I think that it's important to try to like communicate with people who surround us and kind of try to do this at a very like ground level as well, not just so top down.
And this was the last intervention regarding the questions I have prepared. As I have warned you before, we've got lots of questions. I am absolutely sure that we are not able to take them all, which is good because it sounds that our discussion was at least mildly interesting. Yet we have to always think that when we are discussing things like disinformation or hybrid threats, there is an element of surprise and there is an element of disruption. This is why I will take liberty as a moderator to suggest that our speakers will take these questions that we cannot answer home, and they will be maybe answered in writing after the session. So I will ask here the EAD to list the questions, and these that we cannot take, we'll try to answer later on. And here I've got a very strong feeling that we're seriously not coming hard enough on social media platforms. This little motive has been recurring during our conversation, but one of the questions from our audience is precisely on it. So here I would like to ask maybe Professor Toya the question that goes, just one second. What danger do you see if owners of social media platforms just don't want to delete fake news or take actions against election interference on their platforms? So what do we do if they just choose to not act? You can enact some kind of regulations, but how do we approach the problem globally?
This is a very important question, I have to say, because if we want to speak about the regulation social media platforms have on regarding their policies, for instance, on hate speech or their policies on disinformation and misinformation, unfortunately, what we're seeing, right, and this is based on studies, is that the content that surfaces on these platforms hugely contradicts the policies they have or the regulations they have for disinformation and misinformation, right? Or for hate speech, for instance. So, for example, we've had a study into 2021 that showed that 70% of the content on YouTube contradicts its policies against disinformation and misinformation, and that actually a huge majority of the content that surfaces to the users has to do with how the recommendation algorithms function, right? So I think having as Ms. Zaya said a while ago, an external party that regulates such process is essential. You cannot leave social media platforms independent in that sense. I don't see, honestly speaking, a huge difference if they bluntly or openly just announce that we're not regulating our platforms, because in all cases we see an abundance of harmful content circulating and spreading at a very fast and a very wide phase there, right? So I think having a third party regulate is very important.
Another question, this time to Madame Sebeni. One person wrote that as a woman and future mother, I wanted to ask if there's a way to prevent our children from becoming victims of misinformation. We know of pre-banking, we know some societal resilience and other things, but what would you say to what's needed to be done to address this problem and to create this sense of this maybe defensive measures?
Yeah, that's a good question, of course. I think it doesn't differ so much from what we have been discussing. So I would answer on similar lines. Like, of course, like we are doing, or we should be doing, like the regulation of social media for children as well. There we can see that I think, which is pretty interesting, that like TikTok, for example, works very differently in different regions. So there are like different age limits, like what kind of content they can see. It's the same for like YouTube. There is like child YouTube, so that children don't get into like the parts of YouTube where they like shouldn't get into. So I think that there is like a kind of platform regulation with like minors or like children in mind, which I think is important. And I think there again, I could emphasize like the interpersonal aspect of it. I think it's very important, like that parents do engage with those spaces where their children are going on the internet. So I think that like, of course, it's like very difficult to keep up with technology sometimes, and like it's totally normal reaction that like, okay, parents like don't know like oh, I don't know what TikTok is, but my child is like watching TikTok. And I think that like parents should engage them with TikTok if their kids are there. So like, I think that parents should be aware of those like influences that their child is getting, and to be able to like talk about it, like what are we seeing there? And again, just like provide some kind of like guidance and like skepticism towards like, is this true, is this not? So just like encouraging that conversation.
Our audience would like also to understand how can we address bias. Honestly, I have no idea, but maybe Professor Toya can shed some light upon this issue and advice. How is it possible to deal, and how would you propose to deal actually with media bias towards these conflicts, and especially those that maybe don't receive adequate attention, like for example these in the Middle East and in Africa?
Okay, so first of all, let's agree that there is no 100% objective media. It doesn't exist in the whole world, right? So I think three different things. First of all, knowledge of the media industry, right? And this entails two important components as specified by Potter in his 5 knowledge areas. So one of which is the knowledge of the media industry. This includes knowledge of the ownership and knowledge of the economic model of the different media platforms. So if you have knowledge about those two, you kind of start to deconstruct and to understand how or why a narrative is biased. So this knowledge is very important. Strategy number 2, I think, is collateral reading, right? So never read from only one source, read from multiple sources, from different sources with different ownerships, with different editorial lines, right? And reach your own conclusions. And a third strategy here would be learn history, right? So apart from what the media is pushing there from different scenarios, if we're shedding light on the current conflict of Palestine and Israel, I think history has a lot to offer. So learn history from the sides with no editorial agendas, with no editorial lines.
I couldn't agree more. I did take some extra classes of history in high school, so I advise to anyone like taking history and understanding history is one of the elemental things to understand how disinformation works and how somebody tries to manipulate it. Especially that in the beginning of today's discussion, we have agreed that disinformation didn't originate yesterday, and this is a historical event, even if digital technologies are amplifying it right now. And speaking about digital technologies and platforms and similar issues, I would like to ask Madam Sebeni, how can we educate the public and how to distinguish fake news from the real information? I know that we have covered this question to an extent, but here I would like to ask you to focus on a bit more maybe practical and usable things. So if when you open your morning news or when you are just scrolling on X or whichever other platform do you use, if you use any at all, how can you say that, oh, this looks legitimate or authentic, or this account looks a little bit fishy? Can you advise people what should they be doing to recognize fake news from authentic news, good accounts from bad accounts, and so on? This is, I guess, very useful knowledge to everybody.
Sure, I think it's good to also concentrate on the more practical matters. So I think it's always good to check the websites or the newspaper's editorial background. Like, does it even have a editorial background? Because it's very often that, for example, certain websites or certain Facebook pages which have a lot of following, no one knows who edits it. If you don't know who edits it, that's kind of fishy, right? So we should always check who are those behind it. We can usually, if it's a legit source, we can read some kind of bio or previous articles by those journalists, by those editors, who owns that medium. For example, if you take the example of Hungary, you can check okay, who owns this medium? Oh, is this enterprise? Then you know that it's kind of connected to the government, and then you can decide whether you want to read that kind of content or not. But I think that is important. It's again like then comes down to like skills, because it can be very useful to check other sources. It's really good to check other national sources or on the given language, but of course, if one has the opportunity to check in other languages, like how are they reporting about this, if it's an international event especially, I think that's also very useful to see. And then of course, I think we can turn to social media to an extent to like check, for example, on X, like, okay, what are people like saying about this? Like, how does that relate to something that I read, for example, in the news? So I think that like consciously trying to check many sources and trying to check like, okay, where is that coming from, and kind of like placing that in the information environment, I think that is very important. Of course, like if someone is very into this, then there are like more advanced methods, like it can be like, for example, if there's a picture, we can like reverse image search it like quite easily, so we can check that like, okay, was this actually taken where it says it was taken? For example, if you say like a bombing in Ukraine, like I can check like, okay, was this in Ukraine? Was this year? Was this last year? Like, so there are those like methods which could be like more advanced but can be like checked.
Okay, and now with a little bit diverging perspective, we've been discussing various issues. I was mostly asking Professor Toya about Middle East and a bit more societal issues. Now I would like to change it a bit and to hear something a bit more maybe technical here. We have all seen the revolution of artificial intelligence, and I guess many of our participants know that artificial intelligence is also nothing new. It started somewhere in the 60s, if I'm not wrong, but it is constantly developing, and we have seen a major breakthrough in the end of last year and the beginning of this year with large language models such as Chat GPT and Bard and everything else. And here a question to you, Professor. Do you believe that the rise of the new technology and especially AI will contribute to fight our abilities to fight disinformation, or maybe it will increase disinformation, or both? What is your stand in this particular subject?
As a matter of fact, that's an amazing question and a very important one, because an integrative part of the media environment and the information environment nowadays is the artificial intelligence. I would very simply answer that it's a double-edged weapon, right? So it provides a lot of potential, right, in its uses, in aiding journalists in their work, for instance, in assisting them in the time-consuming tasks and making them dedicate more time for quality investigative journalism and so on. However, it comes with a lot of dangers and a lot of risks that we should be aware of, especially that during the current times, there isn't enough regulatory frameworks or enough laws to kind of regulate how this is used, and questions of ethics arise, questions of accountability arise, right? So let's reflect on three different examples of the existence of AI in our current media environment. First of all, we have something like the deepfakes, right? And AI, and how the development of the deepfake technology and the artificial intelligence has actually raised the bar for disinformation, making it highly convincing, making highly convincing video or audio content that can deceive even the most discerning viewers, right? So this is one thing. Automated content moderation, as I touched on a while ago. So the risks here is the lack of transparency, the bias based on the data set the machine has been trained on, and censoring or marginalizing certain groups or building certain perceptions about certain groups in such data sets, feeding the AI. The third thing would be targeted manipulation, right? So information warfare tactics can be highly targeted. tailoring the messages to specific demographic individuals, this level of personalization, with all the good it bears, can actually magnify the impact of disinformation campaigns big time. Especially that we can all see that we have moved, in the words of Ellie Pariser, right? We have moved from human gatekeepers to algorithmic gatekeepers, right? So introducing echo chambers where the content that surfaces confirms one's views and resonates with what users interact with. So we have to be very careful around that. We have to equip the users of the media very well regarding such issues, which arise around the ethical use of AI.
I see there is some appetite to explore a little bit more this warfare elements and a bit more military-driven things. And here I would like to ask Madame Sebeni, if you could elaborate a little bit on how disinformation campaigns can be utilized, or as I see it here, weaponized for warfare purposes. For example, in the current situation in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't know if Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the best description, but I understand this is well, understandable to everyone. And also, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that this is the question that asks how these campaigns can be utilized. So in a way, this is a very dangerous and known to all former and current PhD candidates, so what kind of question. So here I would like you to focus on the disinformation campaigns that happen in the field of that conflict, but also what do they bring in and what are the consequences of the disinformation campaigns. Thank you.
That's a very good question. Of course, like I think we already mentioned like a couple of ways like disinformation spreads. That is also true for warfare. So on social media, like fake accounts, bots can spread false information, amplify certain narratives, silence certain narratives. So I think that's very important. I think overall, what is important to note that there is disinformation, of course, like happening in warfare, but there is and we can see it in the Russia-Ukraine war as well. That is basically both sides are attempting to control a narrative around like the issue. So in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the settlements, the military actions, the rise to land, the historical events, the portrayal of both sides' motivation, the actions in the conflict. So it's about like controlling the narrative of like what was what happens and how. And a lot of it like comes down to like bolstering your own population, like their morale, their mood. But for example, in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, it's surely to also like help the like Ukraine, of course, like wants to control the narrative to get the international support. So I think that's, and this is not like, I'm not talking about that they spread disinformation, but like, of course, they have like, they want to control that narrative instead of like Russia controlling their narrative. And I think we can see that in all kinds of warfare, basically.
We've got one more very practical question. A person asks, I would like to receive some tips on adopting the media literacy components, as I understand it, how to become more competent in media literacy and how to elevate my skills, and how can students become more good in analytical thinking and critical thinking. So this is a question about practicalities. This is quite usual that we discuss disinformation, we discuss other issues, but it's not very telling to people who, for example, are not sure whether they have seen disinformation really, if it's something distant or something that happens to us every day. So here I would like to ask you to advise on development of critical thinking and media literacy competences as practical as you can. And also maybe if you were so kind to give an examples of disinformation and misinformation also from your perspective. We had Zias before. I guess this is a good comparison as well. Like narratives, for example. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so regarding media information literacy, there has been different attempts to put a certain definition around this field. I will go back to the classic of their high definition of 1993, the basic competencies of media and information literacy, or of media literacy. The first one is access. Right. So by access here, we're referring to two levels of access. So first of all, having the right of access to information, having the tools to access information. This is one level. And cognitive access, that's another level. Unfortunately, most of the time when we're dealing with the media, we're kind of doing that in autopilot mode, right? We're not really calling our consciousness into what we're using, what we're seeing, why am I seeing this? It's more of an automated process of scrolling and moving from one thing to another without actually calling our consciousness, right? So I think cognitive access here is very important. The second competence of media literacy would be analyze, right? And I think this is the core of the question here. How can we analyze? I really like to use the expression deconstruct the media content. It's very important to realize that media content, wherever it comes from, is always, all the time constructed, and always, all the time bears some sort of subjectivity to it. So it's very important to break it down, to understand how the different forms can be broken down. So for instance, if I'm looking at a news piece, what are the components of this news piece? How can I break it down to understand beyond what the narrative I'm seeing? So dissecting and deconstructing the different types of media content is very important. And this takes some knowledge about how the different formats are constructed, right? Having said accessing, analyzing, this takes me to evaluating, right? So reaching my own conclusion. If I manage to dissect and to deconstruct the media content, as we've been saying, I will most probably reach a more informed opinion, or a more informed evaluation of the content I'm seeing. And this will make me even more competent to create media content. So there are two perspectives here, the perspective of the user of the media and the creator of the media content. And in both cases, I think it's important to apply these competencies of accessing, analyzing and deconstructing, evaluating, and effectively creating media content.
I agree with deconstruction and being very watchful, what you read, what you share, and basically maybe what you consume in terms of media. If I can, I will add a few cents on my end. I think what you can do as students or people who don't have either knowledge or resources to check everything, especially when you're reading things and there's so many of them. I guess the good advice is also to check how it makes you feel. So if you see that somebody is trying to manipulate your emotions, or it generally doesn't feel authentic, you see that something is like maybe generated, or it feels odd, just don't share it. Also check the source. This is one of the things that you can do in a moment, and this is perfectly, I think, doable in that case. And here we've been discussing all those regulations and trying to build societal resilience, the role of state, the role of social media, and the role of civil society in a way. Still, there are some ethical considerations when it comes to countering disinformation. For example, do we want our information environment to be heavily regulated by state, and what happens if that state is not exactly the most honest broker in that deal? So the question to Madame Sebeni, about these ethical considerations in countering disinformation, if you could, in the context of free speech and freedom of expression.
Yeah, I think that is a very difficult question, and a question that I think as a society, or like as societies, we are grappling with, like where to draw this line and like how to do this. Like the most obvious ethical question is the free speech versus harm prevention. So while we consider free speech as a cornerstone of like democratic societies, it is not an absolute. So we already have like certain, or like most societies have certain laws about that, like speech that incites violence or like defames individuals or causes direct harms is often already like regulated. But of course, like determining that threshold of regulation without infringing on like free speech rights is a major ethical challenge, and is something that we are grappling with. Also, like another ethical challenge, which is of course like interesting, is the truth versus censorship. So in the efforts to like combat disinformation, there is a risk of like overreach that could like lead to censorship of the legitimate discourse. So the question, like, of course, like arises like who decides what is true and who decides what is not true. And giving this power to governments or corporations could lead to abuses, and does lead to abuses of suppression of dissent. So again, I think that is something. And I will just like say a third ethical thing maybe, which could be like responsibility and say accountability. So there's a question about who is responsible for the spread of like disinformation. Is it the individual who like shared it? Is it the platform that hosted? Is it the original creator? All of them. So determining that accountability, especially in an online world that values anonymity and free exchange, is very difficult. So we do have these ethical dilemmas that are being sorted in the moment.
One more question to Professor Toya. We have been discussing this a little bit. We touched upon that topic, but there is a bit more appetite on understanding how do we ensure that anti-disinformation efforts do not threaten freedom of speech. I understand that in this case, we're discussing a little bit more about social media platforms and not, for example, state regulation. So in terms of services, the content monitoring and moderation, removing of harmful and other content that goes against these TOS. And well, specifically, the person asked, in these cases when this content moderation is and persecution is politicized, so we see that there could be bias on the side of the social media platforms. I promise that we will not be going so light on social media platforms, so I guess this is another opportunity to rectify things here.
Okay, start with the understanding of how the social media platforms function, right? What is their business and economic model is like? What do they benefit from, right? This is very important to understand. And this takes us, it's very interesting that this question is raised, because just a week ago, we were having a series of debates of young Egyptian students were debating around different issues related to media literacy. And one of the debates centered around the idea of regulating versus free speech, right? So shall we regulate? Is it a good idea to regulate or not? And when we're talking about regulation, many questions arise. The question of national security, the question of freedom and privacy, and so on and so forth. So I think finding a balance there is very important. Agreeing on some sort of shared definitions, as much as possible, widely shared definitions, involving different stakeholders in the process of setting these definitions. So what is misinformation? What exactly does it entail? What is freedom of speech? What is hate speech? When can I say that removing this content is interfering with my freedom? And when can I say that removing this content is for the public good? Right? So setting very clear operational definitions of these different terms is highly essential in order to find a balance between regulating and at the same time maintaining the freedom of speech and freedom of expression on such platforms.
And I think this is the last question that we're going to take today. Apologies to all those that asked questions, but they were not answered. I must say that from my personal experience, I have never seen this many questions during any disinformation linked and disinformation addressing panel, which is very flattering, but we will try to get back to them if it comes to the matter and subject after the conference in writing. And the last question goes to Madam Sebeni, and please mind that you've got only 3 minutes before it concludes. in some cases, we can say that the trust in public institutions has been a bit severed, and we need to regain that trust, rebuild the institutional ability to counter disinformation, and also the public trust of its institutions. But it concerns also media. So how would you rebuild and how would you reinforce that trust in traditional media and in public institutions, especially among young people who might trust them less than other groups of society?
Yeah, besides like reiterating media literacy and all of what we have talked about, I think especially with young people and especially regarding traditional or I'm going to say like legacy media, I think it's important, and legacy media is already doing that, to engage with youth. So probably we don't have to like encourage young people to like grab a newspaper, like an actual newspaper, like the physical one, but we can already see that like legacy media is reaching out to young people, like starting a YouTube channel, which is such like similarly like quality content and like trustable and like provides quality content to them, or like already are present on TikTok where they provide like quality content. So I think that like traditional or legacy media like has to like engage with young audiences where the young audiences are, and basically that's how you can create that trust. So it's not necessarily like going back in time to do it how we used to, that like that they will read the newspaper on the bus, but like basically legacy media going where the youth are and providing the quality content there.
And I would also add here that, especially from the perspective of public institutions, that trust in institutions is also originating from the said institutions treating their obligations seriously and acting in a composed manner and using integrated approach against disinformation, other hybrid threats, and also addressing it societies in the way they should. For example, using adequate strategic communication, or engaging the state in raising awareness against disinformation, and running formal and non-formal education and media literacy courses, but also about being transparent and engaging in a dialogue with their own citizens, which is not always, sadly, the case. We're approaching the end of this panel. I would like to thank both of our fantastic panelists, and also I would like to ask our audience to join me in congratulating and thanking for this fantastic session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for all the questions and the attention.